Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. We have a book review for you today. Full disclaimer, I received this as an ARC for free via Book Sirens in return for an honest review. This book is our comeback tour is Slaying Monsters, book 1 in the Boybands and Dragons series by Kim Smuga-Otto. This was a lot of fun. We're going to start by going through the blurb for this one before we touch on the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before my final thoughts at the end of the video. Let's dive straight in. We're getting the band back together. You want in? Against his better judgment, Carl Moretti, the least notable member of the once world-famous boy band Neverboyland, says yes. He's prepared for the drama and the clashing egos that drove the band apart 4 years ago. What he isn't expecting is for a VR publicity stunt to teleport the band to the magical land of Mythreal. The good news? They're greeted by Sufi, an attractive young mage, a true fangirl in the making. The bad? She's in trouble with the law, and Carl's bandmates have no clue how to cope with a real magical world. They don't play nerd games. So if you have seen the Jumanji films, or probably more accurately in many regards, the old Dungeons and Dragons cartoon from the 80s, you know the basic idea of the conceit of this. A group of real-world people are sucked into a fantasy environment, and at that point they've got to, basically become adventurers within this fantasy environment. They're sucked in, they're given classes based on their personality types, and they are revered as they are the summoned otherworldly heroes of the land. Only one of them knows this world. That one's Kyle, who is our POV character throughout the majority of this one. The others just think this is a PR stunt, and what you have then is them, first of all, coming to terms with the fact that this isn't PR, so they've got to do the quest to get out of here. And also dealing with this strange new world where the rules are slightly different. And they're slightly different for these characters as well. We'll get onto that a little bit later on. And you have the dynamic, because this is a boy band that's been apart for years. It was kind of torn apart by internal strife and COVID. You know, that perfect double header of isolation with people makes you really, really hate them. So you've got this group trying to learn how to work together again, which was the whole idea of the band practice that they were meant to be doing within this VR space. And from that point, it actually plays out in many ways like a quest does in a RPG, especially a computer one. So thinking of something like Dragon Age or Baldur's Gate, where you have a number of small quests and maybe even side quests leading up to a mystery and a reveal and a choice for how to deal with it. This is a fairly straightforward approach to the story and the plot, but it works really, really well. Especially when you consider the fact that this is structured very much like a CRPG quest log, the way it works. Really interesting to see this as a written analogy for me personally. I had a great deal of fun with the story of this one. So this is told from multiple points of views, but the main two are from Kyle and from Sufi, who is the NPC or non-player character within the world we're introduced to. And the character work here is actually really, really interesting, because this is obviously integrating mechanics from games, basically. And it's interesting how those mechanics actually build into the world and the characters, because these are the heroes, so the rules that apply to them, so for example Tristan, who takes the fighter, is not the same as the rules that would apply for a fighter in this world. It's slightly different, it's slightly advantaged. And that is leveraged really well with a sense of not hatred, that's the wrong word, but jealousy, I suppose, towards these newcomers from some of the characters. Now, you do have the band, so you have Tristan, who is very much the charismatic frontman. You have Oscar, who's kind of the sort of the second in line, but is very much the one who looks after the band. You have Cole, who is sort of the bad boy, who's been in and out of rehab. And then you have Mika, who is the very iridescent, ephemerate, porcelain-skinned musical genius behind their success. And then you have Kyle, or the other one. Often described initially, he was given the moniker of the quiet one, which he hated because all the good ones were taken. So he pushed for the one of the nerd. So unsurprisingly, he becomes the wizard of the group. And this is really his story of finding acceptance for his place in the group, because he's very much seen himself as, well, I'm not the best dancer, I'm not the best singer, I'm not the best looking, I can hold a tune, I can dance a little, I'm not a musical genius, I'm just there. And you have a level of imposter syndrome going on with him as a character, feeling like he isn't good enough to be part of the band, and he's not important enough. And that then plays into the combat and some of the situations that they find themselves in world, where he feels like he isn't living up to his bandmates' abilities because he's just him. And you have this wonderful character growth that goes on with him as he begins to realise that, no, he can do great things and he is important, but also he doesn't realise how important he is seen to by, should I say, by the other characters. And this is something that comes up quite on, because eventually he hits the point of thinking, well, they're just not going to listen to me because I'm just the nerd. So goes off on his own with Sufi to try and sort things themselves. And this causes a little bit of conflict, but a really sweet moment of, no, you are important. And that's really well done. Sufi is an interesting one as well, because very much starts off very NPC coded. So very obtuse in their answers. If you've ever played a video game and you've had conversations with characters in video games, that because of the nature of the fact they can't be as reactionary, you have this odd stilt to the way they speak quite often, and you end up repeating yourself, and it can be really frustrating at times. And Sufi starts off a little bit like that, but not as much as everybody else. And you see a growth as basically she stops being the NPC character and becomes a player character in many regards at the end. And a very similar thing to Kyle, in that doesn't feel good enough to live up to their lineage of wizards in her case. Bits of a failure, makes loads of mistakes, tends to miscast things, and the only time that she has to miscast something, she miscasts that correctly, so it doesn't work. So you have that interesting synergy between the two characters there as well, and they are the focus of this story. You have a number of characters, though, swinging around the outside, not least the bandmates. They don't feel entirely fleshed out as yet now. Each of the books in the series follows a different band member, so I suspect what is going to happen is we'll have more fleshing out of their backstories and their drives and their ambitions throughout that. Tristan's is the one that I'm kind of really interested in getting into, actually. Although I believe it's Oscar that's up next. But Kyle feeling like the outsider means that this works really well as an introduction to the series, because there is levels of integration here, but also outsider syndrome that works really well. And as for the other characters that aren't the band members, who all do have very clear roles within the story, and what I really do like is how the personalities are moulded into the classes that they're picked. There's only one that I don't quite click with, and that's Tristan, because when I read the way he was described and his character stats, one of two options came to me. One was a paladin and one was a bard. Now, the interesting thing is nobody in the party is a bard, and that's actually brought up in the book, which was very smart. But he's also not a paladin, he's just a fighter, which is unusual if you play D&D. Fighters tend not to be high charisma leading characters. Paladins, on the other hand, do. So that was an interesting choice, and I'm curious as to exactly why that is, and I suspect there's going to be an answer to that in his book. But the other characters have this weird stilt to them where they don't feel quite fully fleshed out, so they feel quite linear in their interactions, just like they would in a video game. They do clearly have their drives and their ambitions, their jealousies, the fact that these other worlds have come in to swoop and save them, even though they don't know anything that they're doing, is really well realised early on, which nearly goes horribly wrong. Just really interesting chemistry between everybody, and it does evoke some of those video game things, especially with the better RPGs. I need to stress that as well, with the party bands and stuff that's going on. So decent character work here, especially so focused on Sufi and Kyle. World building then. The world building is solid but info dumpy. And that is by design because, again, you're finding out a lot about the world from the characters within it. And if you ever speak to characters in a video game, they're very info dumpy at times, to the point where you stand there going, just shut up and tell me what I've actually asked you. Something that is referenced in here. The descriptions of the world are actually really, really well done. They don't go into too much detail, but enough for you to be able to envisage the space. You have some interesting geopolitical things going on involving druids, lumber companies, and the local town. You find out a little bit about the world around this town. This is basically the arse end of nowhere, really. Nothing interesting ever happens here. This isn't where true heroes would be pulled to. And then obviously you have the things to do with laws of magic as they slowly get unwound, because in many ways this is a tutorial level of a game. So this is teaching the player, or us as the reader, the mechanics, and that is done quite well too. And it's done in a way that doesn't overwhelm, because this is a fully realised world which does have a history. And we get bits and snippets of this history, especially around some heroes who were around previously. And that is possibly the most interesting bit of lore building, as we go from these venerated heroes and find out more and more and more until we reach like the end of the book, and it's like, were these heroes really? Have they not just caused all these problems that we're now going to have to tidy up? So you have the idea of the myth and the reality as well, which is well done. There's clearly still a lot still going on here though, and a lot more to uncover and discover. And I can't wait to see what else comes in here. This feels like something that could do with a book within a book, bizarre though that sounds. As quite often what you'll get in games is you'll get these little documents that you'll pick up, and I actually kind of like the odd bit of that in here where they're just glancing through like a library in the town they're in, and they just include like a snippet from one of the books. I would have liked to have seen a little bit of that just to add context. But again, this is context being given by characters that have no context, either from the main character's point of view, and NPCs are always frustratingly linear, so it does make sense for how it's been done. Overall, this is very solid world building in a very computer gamery sense. In terms of presentation then, now this is my first literary RPG. So I don't really have anything to hold this to. I kind of expected more visual elements of the RPG mechanics to be present. So almost to have more physical screens on page, if that makes sense, while the characters are doing stuff. And there are moments of this in here. So for example, when spell casting is occurring, it's almost like a radial menu, and the actual incantations and the sort of the movements needed to cast a spell are more like going through the wheel and finding the bits that you need, which I really appreciate. It does have the odd, not quite infographic, but like the class detail pages where you have a picture of the main character, the character stats and their abilities on there. Like that quite a bit. There's also, towards the end of the book, you've got a list of Marjorie's rules. Now, Marjorie is the band manager, and these are rules for the band to live by, and that comes in as well, which I didn't touch on earlier, probably should have done, as quite important, especially in the conclusion as well, because this is what keeps the band alive, and it's very much their driving force throughout. What else is there? You have multiple POVs in here. Now, most of the story, as already mentioned, is told from the point of view of Kyle and Sufi, and they have that interesting parallel going on. And it's interesting listening to the inner monologues, because Sufi doesn't feel like a real person at the beginning and does by the end, whereas Kyle is just insecure and has imposter syndrome. But there are a couple of moments where you have other characters step in just to add that little level of context. And again, what I like about this is something that you quite often again see in video games where you'll complete something, then you go to a cutscene and you'll see something happen. It's nothing that you will ever see happen. Your characters are not there. You cannot see this, but it's shown to you to add context to what's going on, to give you more of a driving force. And I appreciate that here as well, because it sort of replicates that same sort of feeling. I really like the cover. Cover's absolutely stunning as well. That's actually what initially drew me to this. And the writing style in general is just fun and easy and flows really, really well, which made this an absolute blast to read. I read this in 2 sittings. And one of those sittings was like the majority of the book. So there we go. This is really well presented. Final thoughts then, and I just want to mention the page count for this because this is 473 pages long. It didn't feel like it. I had an absolute blast with this one. I think the characters are fun, the concept is neat as well. I think it does a really good job of paralleling how video game characters talk and how world building works without going overly heavy into the mechanics. This is my first lit RPG, so I don't know if this is a typical example of the genre. We'll find out as I move further in. But I like the fact that a lot of the stuff in here was more implicit rather than explicit in its execution. And there are plenty of Easter eggs as well, which I like my Easter eggs in books and media, so that's always appreciated. I had an absolute blast with this. Now again, this was a arc read that I received for free. Just want to put that in here again from Book Sirens. So thank you for that one. But I had an absolute blast and I cannot wait for book 2. I gave this 4.5 stars out of 5. That's Our Comeback Tour is Slaying Monsters by Kim Smuga-Otto. What I would like to know is, have you read any lit RPGs? What were they? What did you think of them? Let me know in the comment down below, and I will catch you all very soon.